reluctant lumberjack might be how you could describe Jake Kerr. He really wanted to be a marketer and an ad man. So he turned his rail cars into rolling billboards, and in doing so, he raised the profile of his lumber company and other BC foresters. Then, when it looked like the Softwood lumber deal with the U.S. was about to collapse, Jake brought his magnificent interpersonal skills to the table and helped strike a deal with the Americans who were determined to handicap the BC industry. Thanks, Jake, for joining us for this conversation. You seem to me like a person who has a whole lot of fun in life, whether it's business or personal. Is that an accurate description?
I hope so. I think so. I personally think the most important thing, attribute a person can have is a sense of humor. So I guess it goes along with that.
Although you can't say no one's childhood is perfect. You were telling me at one point that your father actually went broke when you were just a young one.
He did. Luckily, I was too young to remember it. It was when I was 1. My dad had bought a sawmill up at Whistler Mountain and didn't understand that it snowed in the winter. Did really well in the summer and went bankrupt in the winter. And so I spent my first birthday at Whistler. Fortunately, he then discovered the interior and moved to Williams Lake and did a little better.
Yeah. And your mom?
My mother was a concert pianist. She was quite famous in the 1940s and 50s and played everything from Carnegie Hall to a circuit in Europe every year when I was small. And basically, she paid the bills for quite a while. And
you decided to go off to university and at one point ended up at Berkeley in the 60s.
I did.
Well, that would be fun.
Well, and it was one of the real highlights of my life. I have to credit a friend of mine who I still see a lot, Phil Lind, with the fact that he pushed me to go and look at some U.S. universities. Phil and I went on a road trip, and the first...
You and Phil on a road trip? This is not a good combination.
No, it was not a good combination. The first place we went was Stanford, and they were quite stuffy. They said, here's your curriculum. Why do you want to go here? And I didn't really know, and I don't think they were impressed, and I wasn't either. The next day, we went to Berkeley, and it was something straight out of the movies. There was a bunch of music playing and people smoking dope. Unfortunately, I missed smoking dope. I was just a little too old. It was fantastic. So I ended up going to the business school. I'll never forget the interview. It was the opposite of Stanford. They said, why do you want to go here? I said, well, I'm really not sure. And they said, great. That's exactly what we're looking for. People who haven't figured out yet what they want to do. So I went there for a couple of years, had a really good time, was a teaching assistant when I graduated, and stayed in San Francisco, was in the advertising business for a number of years before I came back. It was a fantastic time to be in San Francisco. So I was from 1966 to 69, when the sort of summer of love was going on and all that.
So did you become a hippie?
No. I was an advertising guy. I think Mad Men rather than hippie.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. But it was also a time of Vietnam.
It was.
Now, you were a foreign student there. Were you exempt?
No. Most people can't believe that Canadians would have had to go in the draft, but I did. Because, and it actually makes sense if you're an American, why would you draft your own young men and send them off to Vietnam and let some guy like myself, who's a foreign student, stay? So I went through the draft, and I actually got called, and it scared the bejesus out of me because you went to this big auditorium, and I had in my hand a letter from my doctor that said I'd had a childhood bone disease in my knees, and I wasn't capable of serving. But I couldn't find anybody who was interested in reading the letter, and the process kept going on, and I really started to get worried that I'd never get to show the letter to anybody. And luckily, at the end, there was the last doctor sort of said, and is there anything else? And I produced the letter, and he said, oh, well, you're out.
You mentioned Mad Men, and when you talked to me about being in marketing and advertising in San Francisco and then New York, that's the image that comes to mind.
Well, and that is exactly, I mean, I didn't watch all of Mad Men. I watched a lot of it flying back and forth across the country, but it was very accurate. It really was. The first day I was in the advertising business, I was brand new. My boss came in and said, look, I got to talk to you. There's a couple of things. First of all, we don't start here till 10 o'clock if you're an executive. And secondly, don't ever, ever let me find you in this office over lunch. You go out with a client, and if you don't have a client, just go out. So
and have a drink.
Oh, absolutely. We the guys from my agency and clients used to go to a bar/restaurant called The Leopard down in the bowels of San Francisco. And it was a standing deal. We had a booth, and you'd have a couple of drinks before lunch. You would have at least a bottle of wine with lunch, and you'd always have a cognac or something later in the afternoon. So you were gone from basically lunch hour for everybody was 12 to 2, but it was usually like 12 to 3. And the only rule I really learned was never, ever sign an email after lunch. But that was the 60s.
And you enjoyed it?
I loved it. I never wanted to leave. I thought being in the advertising business was fantastic. And I very much, I couldn't resent it because the reason I came back to Vancouver is my father was ill. And I didn't realize how ill. He'd had a heart attack in his 50s, and he was by now mid-60s. And he wanted to sell the business, and he was having trouble getting it done. And so he asked me if I could come for 6 months maybe, and sort of we'd work together on selling it, which I very reluctantly did. Took a leave of absence, and unfortunately, the business wasn't saleable. It was basically, we weren't broke, but we were just churning enough money to pay the payroll and pay ourselves. We were building no capital. We had 3 old sawmills, and it was a mess. And he really had it with the business. So we did our best. Unfortunately, he died in 1972. And so I ended up stuck. And I thought, again, for 6 months, gee, I'll find a way out of this. And I came very close to selling the business. It's actually quite a funny story. Sam Ketchum, who started West Fraser Timber, now the largest company in the world in lumber, was a really good friend of mine. We're both stuck in Williams Lake. And I went to him and I said, look, you know I want to go back to San Francisco. Would you consider buying Lignum, my company? He said, oh, sure. And they made me a very, very low-ball offer. Basically, they said, we'll give you the equity back you have in it, which is giving it away. But I wanted to go so much that I sort of thought, well, okay. But I said, there's 2 things. I just got a new car, and it's in the company, and I need a job. I don't have any money. So would you consider letting me keep my car, and would there be anything I could do at West Fraser? And they said, well, let us think about that. So Sam called me back the next day. He said, we really want to do the deal, but I'm awfully sorry. I talked to my brothers, and no, you can't have the car, and we've got nothing for you. And then I thought to myself, what have I done now? So
you've used the phrase stuck in Williams Lake.
Yeah, and I wasn't that keen. It wasn't really much like going to the Leopard for lunch. So I thought to myself, though, I've got to do something because I don't know anything about the lumber business. I know something about marketing and sales. So I went to a conference, the first one they had called the Sawmill Clinic in Portland, Oregon. All the sawmill guys went, and they had lectures on things, and 99% of what they were talking about I couldn't figure out at all. And there was a nice gentleman who I thought was old at the time. He turned out he was 50, named John Ailport. And he gave a lecture on, I'll never forget it. It was I still don't know what it is, something called Best Opening Face. And it was how you cut a log with a saw and you twist the log around so you get the best piece of lumber. And I listened to him and thought, I had no idea what he was talking about. We sat down for lunch in a big ballroom, and I happened to be seated next to this guy. And he was the nicest fella, and he'd been to our mill in Williams Lake on a tour, and he said, oh, yeah, I know your mill quite well. You know, it wouldn't take much to get it going. Well, to cut a long story short, he was getting a divorce. He lived in Spokane, and somehow we got together, and I was the 28-year-old guy who knew nothing, and he was the 50-year-old guy who really understood sawmilling. And over the next 20 years, John Ailport saved my life.
At what point would you say that you really began to understand the forestry business?
Well, I actually understood parts of it. I never, to this day, understood how the edger worked or the log sorter. I mean, I spent hours looking at it. It's interesting, but I can't fix a toaster, so I have no idea about most of the mechanical side. The two things I knew, one I was sure of from the time I was a small boy, and that was my father used to talk about the business. The one thing I learned when I was in my teens is the thing that mattered most to him was access to the U.S. market. Your costs could be a little high or a little low or whatever, but you had to be able to sell lumber into the U.S. So right off the start, I knew that much. I also knew a little bit about marketing, and some of the things that they did in the lumber industry at the time I thought were very odd.
Like?
Well, they would go to great pains to produce a nice-looking, clean piece of lumber. And in those days, there were two ways to ship it. You took the individual pieces of lumber and you basically threw them into a boxcar. And they sort of got stacked up properly. They closed the doors, and the boxcar went to Michigan, by which time it had been shunted a whole bunch of times on the railway. And so you'd open the boxcar and there'd be this spaghetti jumble of pieces of wood. And I thought, that doesn't, and a lot of it was broken. A lot of people would claim, oh, we didn't get what we asked for. And so it dawned on me that there must be a better way to do that. The other way they shipped it was on a flat car. So then they did have a steel band around it, but it would be sitting out in the weather for 10, 15 days, getting all sorts of oil and grease on it. So the two things that Lignum did that no one had done before was we had a system for piling the lumber in the car and then it's pretty rudimentary, putting a band around it so it didn't get broken. And particularly on the flat cars, we experimented with putting plastic bags over the lumber so that when it got there and went into someone's yard, it was good looking. Trial and error is a great thing. The first bags I really liked, and also no one had ever heard of a logo. No one put their name on anything. The first company in the industry in this part of the world was tiny old Lignum, who I knew a lot about logos. So we had a logo and we had a name in a specific type. And we leased a fleet of cars. So we leased 100 cars that were Lignum cars and couldn't be used by anyone else. And it gave me a chance to go and put logos all over the side. And that later became an industry standard. So where I was able to contribute was basically in marketing and to some lesser degree in finance. That actually didn't go so well in the beginning.
Banks called your loans?
Gotcha.
So you took a company that you just couldn't sell, almost had to give away, and built it up to how would you describe Lignum at its best?
It was one of the largest privately owned companies, forest companies in Canada. By the time we sold, I think we had something like 45 or 50 distribution centers, and we were a big supplier to they didn't have Home Depots at the time, but when Home Depot came along, we were one of their largest suppliers, and we supplied Lowe's and all of the big chains. And it worked really well.
But those must have been heady days when you had built such a successful company, had huge offices in downtown Vancouver, top of the business world.
Yeah, well, the lumber business, on the other hand, is really cyclical. Listen, in that business, you learned that, yeah, have fun while you can, but it's always going to come back and bite you.
And running along throughout your career in forestry, of course, is the trade issue with the United States and the softwood lumber deal. How did you get pulled into the negotiations?
We got into the early 90s. I was by now the chairman of the BC Lumber Trade Council, and we decided that we had to have a national response because the Americans were filing a variety of lawsuits against us, claiming that we were subsidized because of our stumpage systems.
So before you got to the softwood lumber deal, what were negotiations like behind the scenes? Was it friendly, hostile?
I'd say it was harder to get a deal with the Canadian provinces than with the U.S.
Quebec.
Yeah. And I figured out a lot of the Canadian CEOs had never really had much exposure to Washington, didn't understand the trade laws exactly, and just assumed the other guys were bad guys. And I took the opposite view. I went and got to know a number of the American guys really well, to the point where during the 1996 negotiations, which was the most famous lumber deal that we did, I had a way better idea at times what the Americans were really up to. When it came to actually making a deal, Quebec was a huge problem. This was the only file, and probably still is, where there was a brief shining moment where British Columbia got to drive the bus. And Quebec just assumed, quite rightly, that this will never happen. In the end of the day, we'll take care of this. And so they didn't pay much attention. They sent junior guys to Washington and Ottawa. I think they probably counted very much on the fact that Raymond Chrétien was the ambassador, and he was from Quebec. And I also got to know Rick Chrétien very well. And at the end of the day, we were able to cobble together a deal for a quota rather than a tax. And everyone in Ottawa simply told me flat out, you can't do a quota. At the end of the day, particularly Chrétien realized that we had this strange alignment of BC and the U.S. against the other Canadian provinces. And Chrétien wanted to get the matter off his desk, I'm darn sure. And in the end of the day, we made a deal. British Columbia, by ourselves, went and made a deal with the U.S. So there was a huge kerfuffle for a few days. We got the deal. The price of lumber went up like a rocket, and we had the best 5 years in the industry we've ever had.
So you did sell your company.
Yep.
Well, and decided, I feel like playing some baseball.
Well, that's almost exactly right. I had been going to Nat Bailey Stadium since I was 10 years old with my dad, and I've been a baseball freak all my life. And so my brother and I went out to see the owner, who was a very eccentric old guy named Fred. And Fred, I think, lived under the stadium. Fred weighed about 300 pounds. The first meeting we had, he was polishing off his third or fourth Budweiser of the morning and eating popcorn. And it was an interesting negotiation, to say the least, because financial statements, we don't do those. Asset values, I don't care. I've got a price, and that's the price. Well, the price was, I'm usually fairly analytical, but this was just sort of okay. Yeah, that sounds fine. And I did virtually no homework. I just thought it was really kind of neat that I was going to be at Nat Bailey Stadium. I figured maybe I'll coach third base or, put on a uniform. Didn't work out that way. But it
was in bad shape when you bought it.
Terrible. I mean, I realized quite quickly when I did start looking at it that I wasn't really in the baseball business. I had a fast food restaurant attached to a baseball field. But the first year, we just had a completely chaotic situation where we didn't really have any management, and we lost a lot of money, and I wondered what the heck I'd done. Again, luckily, I found my modern-day version of John Aylport. I found a guy named Andy Dunn, who is still the president of the Canadians, has been for 12 years. We've had a great run at Nat Bailey. We've been sold out now for 5 or 6 years. We're the only minor league team that has scalpers outside the stadium, and you can't get a ticket.
And the marketing side of you, of course, had a chance to flourish.
Yeah, I mean...
Because I remember being at a restaurant with you when you were testing out hot dog sushi to see if it would work.
That's right, and it has.
It had? Oh, it was
yeah.
awful.
Well, it is awful, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it's like the things that people eat at baseball games. Andy Dunn, again, has been a genius at this stuff.
You've given so much back to the community. You've been busy with your business career, obviously, but if I look at all the boards that you've been on, you've really given back. Does that drive you? Is that in your head all the time?
Yeah, I really enjoy it, and I always have. I was chair of the Vancouver Foundation for about 8 years and learned a great deal about charities throughout the province and how much it meant to the communities. When I started there, I was on the Arts and Arts Granting Committee, and we'd give grants of $500. And I'd say, well, what would $500 do? And they said, well, if you're in the little theater in Nelson, it's a fortune because they have no revenue. And so I started to realize that you didn't have to be giving people $1 million. It was just helping out in the community. And I've continued on. I was the first chancellor of Emily Carr University, and I'm interested in the arts and art. And so that was a great honor and a pleasure for 8 years.
When you look back over all of your complicated career and life in business, what was the darkest moment for you?
Probably my father dying in the early 70s. It was totally unexpected, and it really did derail my plans. Having said that, it led to a career that was so much more interesting than I would ever have had being an ad man in San Francisco. But at the time, that was a real setback.
What values or philosophy would you say has been behind your life?
Good question. I think I've tried to do things in an honorable way. I think that people can rely on me. I think that I have tried to make sure that we didn't do things that we would later regret as a business. So I think we had a very good track record through all the years. And personally, I won't do things that I think are unprincipled, or certainly try not to. And I don't know, treat other people like you'd like to be treated.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.
Jake Kerr, a BC legend.